Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight, whatever time it is for you. It might just be evening if you're on the West Coast. My name is Micah Kielbon. I have the pleasure of producing the Slowdown from APM Studios and also have the pleasure of opening tonight's event. Before getting started, I just want to say I don't work on this alone, and so quickly, thank you to Emily Kittleson, Eleanor Beard, Maria Wortel, and Beth Perlman, my colleagues at APM, and to our production partner, the Poetry Foundation. But more than anything, I want to thank all of you who make the Slowdown possible just by listening, but especially by donating to the show. So tonight we're going to have Major Jackson, our host, and poet Aria Aber in conversation. We're going to start with some poetry and that conversation, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. We're leaving the chat open for participants to connect with each other, but if you want to ask a question, that needs to go in the Q&A function, not in the chat. They're two different things. We won't see anything in the chat. Please be nice to each other in there, and I hope you find some friends perhaps. But so usually on the Slowdown, you just hear one person, you hear Major Jackson, along with bringing you a poem and a moment of reflection every weekday. Major is also a professor at Vanderbilt University and the editor of the Harvard Review. I'm sure you know many of his accolades, but I also want to congratulate Major as the publication of his sixth book, Razzle Dazzle, New and Selected Poems, has been recently announced by Norton to come in September. Usually you hear Major alone, but tonight you're going to hear him with the poet Aria Aber. Major will be doing a more personal introduction. First, I wanted to give Aria's bio. Aria Aber was raised in Germany. Her debut book, Hard Damage, won the Prairie Schooner Book Prize in Poetry and was published in September of 2019. Her poems are forthcoming or have appeared in The New Yorker, New Republic, the Yale Review, and elsewhere. A former Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University, she is currently pursuing a PhD at USC and lives in Los Angeles. Now, I would like to turn it over to Major, who is going to get us started and tell us a little more about Aria.
Thank you. Thank you, Micah. And thank you, everyone who is here joining us this evening, this afternoon. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all. Thank you for joining us tonight in a conversation with the immensely affecting and hugely talented poet and writer, Aria Aber. Some consider poetry an estate, one that requires stewardship, care, and attention. Most often we turn to editors and curators, but in a way, poets who possess a vision of the art and of language do wonders in advancing lyric expression such that, as our guests once observed, such poetry makes us aware of all the channels wherein humans become human with each other and how we come to be heard, understood, with empathy and decency as our essential truths. I admire in Aria Aber's poems the kind of integrity of vision that is not embarrassed of the poem as a site of intellectual inquiry, as well as an orchestrated act of emotions, an aesthetics that tends to the whole person, the whole spirit, that aims towards clarity. She urges us, just as she urges herself, to not look away, but to look at everything. And thus, beauty and terror are essential qualities that light her imagination. It is the only way, she writes, to activate the world in poetry. As a student in one of my courses at NYU some years ago, she belonged to a cohort of emergent poets whose passion for the estate of literature was most evidenced in the nuanced and fresh readings of poets and their poems across multiple continents. We all walked away those nights of 3 hours of intense conversation with the belief that our essential lives and of those we love depended on carrying forward a belief in literature to grant us grace. She writes out of a multifaceted understanding of global conflict, culture, and language. And for this, I thank her for her poems, her commentaries, her unattenuated intellect and heart. Aria, welcome to the Slowdown.
Thank you so much for that beautiful, very moving introduction, Major, and thank you for having me, everyone.
Yeah, well, we're going to hear poems. We're going to hear poems by yourself and maybe a few by others, but I want to start with the easy stuff because there's writers in the room. Do you always write at a desk? Where are you when you're writing? What's your physical space like?
I am not always at a desk, even though I am seated at a desk right now to keep up the illusion that writers sit at desks. But I actually write the majority of my poems and other writing in bed or sitting on the floor in front of the coffee table. But it's strange. I guess with my first book, I think I wrote the majority of it at a desk, and graduate school lends itself to that kind of seriousness because you have to read a lot. And I had enough space in my room back then to have a really large kind of like kitchen table as a desk where I could like spread out my books and have everything around me. I am a maximalist, I think, in writing and also in life. So I need a large space to work at and a large surface area around me where I can spread out all the books and other things that I refer to while I'm writing. And most of the time when I sit down to draft something, the seed of it has already emerged at an earlier point, especially with poetry, which so often for me begins with sound or a melody or a particular image that's captivating. And I try to write it down on my iPhone notes, the modern notebook, right? Which is really not romantic at all. But that is what I have on me most of the time, even when I am on a walk and I don't carry a notebook with me. And a lot of the language comes to me in motion, actually, when I'm on a walk or I'm driving or I'm on a train or a plane, interestingly, I guess, because those are moments where the mind is forced to be still and to observe its surroundings. And that's when poetry starts knocking at my mind's door. And then when I draft something, I usually take a lot of other people's books with me that I then don't actually refer to, but they're like talismans or something that I think I need their presence to be there. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you? Do you sit at the desk?
Oh man, like you, I'm starting to use notes function. And in fact, now that the chat transcription is far better than it was when it was first invented, I'm talking now. I'm talking lines. We have a mutual friend who does not have her students write poems anymore. She tells them to come to class with the poem memorized. And I don't know if that's some act of saving trees, but I really like the intensity of the poem being so embodied in the self that it emerges out of your body in this oral way. But yeah, I'm working often at a desk, that said. And like you, I make sure I carry my touch tones that are really important to me. Well, one of the things that you said I'm curious about is being a maximalist. And this is something that I have observed and enjoyed in your work, is that you can feel that particular emotion in that kind of Wordsworthian taking a walk, right? Or Wallace Stevens. I totally feel that, but I also feel the presence, and this goes back to my introduction. I also feel the presence that you are unafraid to kind of touch back those writers who are important to you. And as we know, sometimes some people feel as though that can be maybe overly done, or maybe you're being pretentious. do you have any anxieties of the estate by which you are building your work on after?
Well, I think that's a really great question. Thank you. But yeah, of course, I have anxiety about the incredible tradition and also fraught literary history into which I have stepped as a young writer. And at the same time, I feel like it would be ungenerous or false of me to pretend that everything I have thought is a very original thought. I think in quotes. I often refer to other writers' interviews or diary entries or poems or whatever. That's just what my consciousness is made of. I feel like other people have their own life experience or refer to things their friends have said or their parents have said to them once. But the wisdom that I have found, I refer to the most in my life is from the books that I have read by other writers. And I think Mary Ruffel actually says this, maybe in Madness, Rack and Honey, which we read in your class back at NYU, that she became a writer because she wanted to talk back to the dead, to her friends in those books, and tell them that she felt similarly. And I really relate to that. And I have noticed, I think as I was compiling my poems for today, that, oh, I do this a lot, and maybe I should write some poems where I'm not quoting another writer for a little bit and see what would happen, right? But I think the most fun I have when I sit down to write is to engage with another person's line or poem or writing, what it has sparked in me, and how I can, maybe create my own answer to that, and put myself. I mean, this is very megalomaniac to say, like, I'm putting myself in conversation with James Merrill or Dante, but I'm not necessarily doing that. I'm honoring what they have given me, and also allowing that to enter the poetic space, like that kind of like discursiveness or the conversational aspect of engaging with intellectual matters.
This is a good way to kind of maybe go into Zelda, which will be our first poem, but you also wrote somewhere that you were quoting Eliot, and I'm thinking about this in relationship to fraught legacies. You said poetry is the soul of a nation. And as we know, nations shift. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about your belief in that. It's a shared belief. I want to say that. How do we contend as writers inheriting that fraught legacy?
Do you mean the fraught legacy of a nation, like that, or a fraught
right.
legacy?
I'm thinking about
history?
nationhood. That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
And literature and how it creates, because we're going through this right now. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I think first of all, everybody probably has a very individual way of dealing with it. But as writers of a marginalized background, as both of us are, I think it's especially fraught and strange and often filled with tension and maybe repulsion and anger when you look at these writers who have shaped and formed the canon, and who had political beliefs that were despicable or have done things that you don't agree with on an ethical level. And it is complicated, and I think nuance is needed in order to weed out what we can take from it and what should be thrown out, like how ethical does an artist have to be, and how unethical are they allowed to be. I think it's just a moral standard where, you should treat your artists the same way you would treat your neighbors, right? Like everybody, just because you're a genius shouldn't give you a pass to be a horrible human or a Nazi, right? I think for me, it's always like the Nazi threshold is an interesting, it's an interesting metric to refer to, because I would never forgive anyone for being a Nazi. But then again, I do love T.S. Eliot's poetry, and he was kind of anti-Semitic. So that's an interesting conundrum for me to think about. But in terms of responsibility as a poet or an artist entering in a nation, or being aware that your poetry is participating in creating the soul of the nation through this artifice, I think it is important to remember that language is something that is incredibly political, of course, right? And I think in my first book especially, I am trying to work through that. And Solmaz Sharif, who went through NYU and I think was also a student of yours, says somewhere that demagogues and politicians and poets all use the same medium. We all use language, we all use metaphor and stylistic devices. But in an ideal world, poets are on the opposite end of the spectrum, and demagogues are here. And what our job is at some point is, of course, also to highlight what they are doing to our language, right? Like how can we take care of language? How can we be caretakers of language? And I think that's also a phrase that Sharif uses. And that is something I think that's always in the back of my mind as the responsibility of a writer. And yeah, that we are engaging in something incredibly political just by virtue of the medium that we use in order to create our art.
That's right. Thank you for that. I'm wondering if we could talk about Zelda. Do you want to set this poem up and read it?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, and it goes actually pretty well with what I just said about fraught history, because she is such a complicated person and came from the South and from a very right-wing family, and is not necessarily someone that I am inspired by as an artist. But as you know, I am currently in a relationship with or engaged to another writer, and this is the first time that I am romantically involved with someone of the same trade as me. And I was looking, I mean, I'm not feeling competitive necessarily with my partner, because we write very differently. But I do feel competitive with the addressee or the you or the muse of his poetry and writing when it is not me, because I am selfish. But it's interesting to then think about, okay, what has love and this heterosexual relationship done to my life? It has changed me and transformed me and brought completely new questions into my life and my art. And I was thinking about other couples in literary history, like Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald, and there are so many others. Of course, there's like Mary Gaitskell and Peter Trachtenberg and Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre and so many others across the arts. And she was an interesting person, I think, because she was such a frivolous and hedonistic party girl who was also extremely mentally ill and a tragic figure, and had artistic ambitions, tried to write a novel, which was not very well received. She tried to paint watercolors, which was also not very well received. She tried to become a playwright, which also didn't work out. And she has been flattened, I think, in history in both ways. I think during her lifetime, just being thought of as this frivolous woman who was talentless. And then also on the other side, by the revisionist idea that she was the actual genius in the relationship, and Scott kind of erased her career or sabotaged it. And I believe that the reality is probably somewhere in the middle. She was an ambitious and hedonistic person who loved life and loved love. And she was just born at the wrong time and didn't have the ability to achieve her artistic ambitions, right? To achieve her visions. And I think she lent me this kind of like mask for the persona poem, where I could be playful and playful and glitzy, and kind of think about love and romance and mental illness and boredom and artistic ambition, in this very liberating way, because I'm not necessarily a fan of hers. I think she's just a very complex figure, and it allowed me a lot of room to play. Right. So that's what came out of it. So should I read the poem?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Zelda Fitzgerald. It's true, I hate the stories about the other women, but I love the description of their daily lives, like the scene with 12 raspberry cakes in a French cafe, or the drunkard asking for the way. A bottle of whiskey on a heavy walnut table, my husband's hands on a glass. No one's muses are believable, said the painter whom I loved for 12 weeks and who would rarely touch me. To him, the female body was a plant. It needed to be tended and spoken to, but too much warmth would spoil the matter. In his paintings that I like best, women wander through cities and notice objects, lanterns, hats they can't afford, little glasses of Pernod. I loved him to hurt the other one whom I loved more. And so most of my life, it passes like this. Light touching my skin, lying on the floor among my diaries, writing of him. What did Proust say months before he passed away? I have great news. Last night, I wrote the end, so now I can die. Oh, had I known the boredom that my talents had in store for me, I would still have asked for them.
It's a wonderful poem, and I want to talk about it on a craft level. Well, I want to talk about some of what I talked about, which was the complexity of embodying or assuming a mask of someone that's not your own. This has been a subject of the past couple of years. But I think we are reconciling that this is a useful, imaginative way of building and constructing voice, even voice in a poem. I'm curious about one aspect of your work that I have come to enjoy is how you pull me in as a reader, and something about that first line and many of your first line, they have that effect of you can't turn away, right? Because you want to read what's coming next. And I'm not sure if I covered this in class, but I do feel as though the language or the sentiment has to be in such a way that the reader has to gasp on that first entry into the poem. I mean, there are poems that slowly work on us, but the opening line and the last line, do you have any particular theory about composing or even editing to get to that aha moment, like this is it?
Great question. Thank you. I think with first lines, I need to be interested in myself. I think if a line forms itself in my mind and I can't stop thinking about it and I am drawn to the draft, then I know this is the beginning line, because it's like assertive and it's telling me something, or it's making a grand emotional statement, and I need to go further in order to investigate what it is that the sentence that I'm suddenly proclaiming or my lyric voice is proclaiming is trying to tell me. And that first line in this poem came to me automatically. With the last line, I think it was a little harder, because I've been in my more recent drafts, I've been trying to move away from the easy epiphany. I think I'm less interested in that now. I think I'm more interested in the epiphany either occurring at the very beginning of the poem, which I think here there's a doubling that is bracketing the poem, the first line and then the last two lines. But here, without it, it wouldn't have worked, because the poem towards the the last 4 lines or something, as soon as Proust enters, I think the mask is slipping and it's me who's speaking, and not like this idea that I have of Zelda Fitzgerald anymore. And I'm kind of like talking back, like I'm taking the mic away in some metaphoric way, and trying to talk about a completely different artist, right? And then it becomes a proclamation about writing in general, and the boredom and the solitude that writing kind of forces us into.
That's
and
right.
Yeah, so that's for here. But generally, I don't think I have a theory or a method of editing or revising whereby I know where to end. But I think the beginning is very important to me most of the time, and I do want the beginning to be like interesting and enticing, but mainly for my own attention span, because otherwise I'm not interested in writing the poem, I think.
The mask wearing, I love what you said about slipping, because that's one of my big arguments, is that the mask becomes a way for us to address issues relevant to ourselves, but we can put us at a distance by looking at a figure, someone else for whom maybe known or not known, who has struggled with it. Here, and by the way, you're right to say, Zelda carried forward beliefs and ideas of the Southern Confederacy as the granddaughter of someone who was, a chief dragon in the KKK. So very complicated, but it did not prevent you from engaging her life, which I think is hugely admirable, and part of the reason why I was drawn to this poem when I saw it. But the myth making that happens when you put on a mask, I could feel you kind of at the mask pulling forward, and you. So there's a way in which the mask wearing or the persona becomes empowering in a way. I mean, you could feel that boredom, you could feel that essence. Could you talk about yourself as an artist in relationship to this poem? How does Zelda allow you to address issues of desire? Yeah.
Totally. I love what you just said, that the mask allows you, or the mask wearing allows you to fill the boredom and fill like the empty spaces. And I think it is easier to talk about desire when you pretend it as someone else speaking, right? It's like it's one of those extremely sincere topics, I think, especially when it is the kind of desire that is not grieving a past relationship, but is very much in the present moment, and is trying to look at the complexity of a desire that's still living between you and the other, the lover, the addressee, and it is. As I said, I think I was very, at the time of writing this, I was very much drawn to like studying and reading about all of these other couples in the arts and in literature who have existed. Actually, you and Didi, I'm thinking about right now, and how they have managed this union of like, what does love mean and what does art mean, and how do you privilege one over the other? So I think, writing about desire is something that I have struggled with, and it's also something that is happening for me acutely, and is changing my poems, because my life is changing. And so much of my poems until my first book came out were specifically about family, or renouncing a kind of like romantic desire, and instead filling that space with spirituality or God, or like a striving towards that, and which is also I think a striving towards like God as the other is also extremely erotically charged, and something that exists in devotional poetry for centuries, right?
That's
it's also
right.
a tradition.
I'm thinking of Mirabai and
yes,
so many others. Yeah.
And so I think it's been quite interesting to look at other poets who have been tackling desire. And maybe this leads us to Margaret Ross.
I was just about to say, I was going to ask, that's a great kind of segue to songs.
Yeah, because Margaret Ross's poetry, I could have chosen so many of her poems, she is a great writer of desire, of female desire, and the complexities and the dusky kind of like corners of absence, and the physical experience of it. And Socks in particular, I think, is just a poem that is it's funny and very complex and surprising, and an incredible achievement. Yeah. Should I read it, or do you
Yeah,
want to
I
talk
was
about
thinking, yeah, go ahead and read it because I have a question here.
it? Okay. Socks. The socks came in a pack of 5. What is the most boring subject possible? Translucent blue with punctures pierced to shape a star around the ankle. I carried them along the aisles as if I needed them. I fingered lacquered dishes and the rubber beads, the rubber heads of mallets, crystal trinkets stitched to underwear. Wherever you go, this buffering, a dull hour. All that time I could have touched you and didn't, or did absent-minded, getting in or out of bed or trying to reach something behind you. I didn't need anything I could buy. I bought the socks and a slatted spoon I haven't used, blue interrupted by the living points of constellated skin.
Mhm.
I've been looking for a long time at the stretch of table where you had your hand. I am afraid to touch it. Love, all I've ever seen is things and airless, dense configuration and no transparency.
The ending is such a wow moment.
So incredible. Talk about epiphany.
Right. I think this poem is gorgeous for a number of reasons. One of them, just the clear image making of the socks. And let's just say, let's get it out the way. This belongs to in the great pantheon of poems about socks. I'm thinking of Ode to Socks by Neruda.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Inflected with the interestingly enough, with a sensibility of someone today. But I think on the surface, a poem about socks is risky, not because of that tradition, but because even as the speaker says, there's a banality of a familiar object. And I wonder if you would agree with me that some of the poet's work or job, if there's a job description, is to kind of transform the mundane into the wondrous. And in this particular instance, that transformation happens, for me at least, right there when we start talking about touch. It makes this wonderful turn. I'm curious if you can talk about transforming everyday objects and how you go about that, or how do you see Margaret doing it in this poem?
Thank you for saying that. I completely agree that, first of all, the clarity of the vision here is incredible. And it's something I admire immensely about Margaret Ross's poetry, because I personally have such a tendency to run from image to image and not really sit with an object and study it. And what she does so well in this poem and in other poems of hers, and what I think every poet's role is, as you say, is to transform the everyday and the trivial, and to defamiliarize. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think it is that is the job of poetry and of any art, but especially of like metaphor and image in a piece of writing, is to make it anew and to make us see the thing as it is. And what she does here, I think, is so interesting, because obviously she gives kind of like the prompt first off, in the second line, what is the most boring subject possible? But then she writes the most interesting poem about walking through a shop and being bored and not knowing how to like kill your day. And that is how we live and experience life on Earth most of the time anyway. Most of the time it's like pretty mundane. We're in a car, we're going here or there, and there isn't a big epiphany. But like the emotional texture of the poem is so charged, because the speaker is desiring and lives in this negative space of the absence of the lover. And hence everything else just becomes a filler for what is not attained or has not been attained. And there is like this sense of like regret about also a very mundane kind of not doing something, it's like I could have touched you but didn't. It's not some grand revelation of like I should have taken the train to see you or something, but like it is, again, it's very much rooted and anchored in the dailiness. And I'm just so I'm just smitten with this poem. And I think what I tell my students often, and which I need to remind myself of doing, and to quote another poet here, Marie Howe, is to really sit with the world as you observe it. And I often did, I think I stole this from someone, but when I teach poetry, I have my students keep an observation notebook. And is it from you? Did I steal it from you? Okay, I stole it from you. Great. I forgot, and now I can attribute the source. I knew I had taken it from one of my professors. So I stole it from you to do the observation notebook, because I'm very bad at doing it myself. But when I teach, which is also a great joy of teaching, is that it forces yourself as the teacher to reestablish your relationship with poetry and writing. I also keep an observation notebook, and it's like, it is insane what kind of images emerge when you just like pause for a moment and look at the world. And I think there are how can poets do this? I think poets just need to slow down a little bit, to go to the title of the podcast,
You wrote somewhere, and I'm curious about how this poem enacts this. This is really gorgeous poem, but you said freedom cannot be achieved without sacrificing some other freedom. And as that, I know the context that you said that, but I think in the context of art making, these moments, what we call epiphanies, or these moments where you hit upon a line which feels so elegant and transcendent, and it just why we come to poems, right? I wonder what else, if there is a sacrifice in order to achieve that. So, going back to Zelda, and going back to being an artist, we know that there is a way in which responsibilities prevent us from even just getting to the page. We sacrifice our art for teaching, or we sacrifice our art for our family, etc. So I'm curious about in the composing of a poem, to reach that moment of clarity and understanding. Is there something else that is pushed away?
That is such a beautiful and interesting question. I probably have to think about that for a while. And I wonder what your thoughts are on it. I'm very curious what your answer would be about it. But I think first of all, of course, we're always sacrificing something else. That's just, I think, part of the human condition, to generalize it, because we can't be everywhere else at the same time, and we always say no to something in order to say yes to something, and maybe I don't even agree with myself anymore that, or no, maybe I do, that on a philosophical and political level, that in order to achieve freedom, we need to sacrifice another freedom, or need to abandon another type of freedom. That might be true, but I think in order to reach clarity, we probably have to push away a part of the illusion and the dream that is often safe and easy, and clarity is painful, because it's showing the thing, or the relationship, or your own attitudes to it in a more concrete way, and it's destabilizing and disarming, I think.
Love that. How I would answer it, I'm thinking about, there's always that question, what do you do when you hit a writer's block, right? And I think for me, I'm at a threshold of the imagination where I can't go, I can't push it any further. Now, one of my favorite quotes from Jack Gilbert is that, you know, he believes like poets go out and create some situation. Like when they're at that threshold, they create some situation. And he says, I'm not going to sacrifice my life for my art. Like I'm not going to construct these, like, you know, these scenarios and so that I can get some enlightened moment. For me, I just love sitting in that silence and allowing the world to kind of do its wonders on me. I would love to write a line like, love, all I've ever seen is things in airless, dense configuration and no transparency. I mean, that's claiming that space of silence and an inability to kind of pierce. And that's what we're trying to do, is pierce. So I think we are at a moment of pierce that densely, brother. I think we're at a moment of hearing from the audience. And I think we have some questions coming in.
Back with some questions. Thank you guys both so much for that like lovely conversation. I'm just here as a talking head for our lovely audience who has submitted questions already. And this one actually kicks back to something that was discussed earlier, and wondering to both of you if you have a muse. Go first.
You know, would it be corny to say other poets? Like I have, as you can see, I have books around me. This is just a fraction. I don't have a single muse, but I've been reading and writing for so long that certain voices emerge, almost just like randomly. You know, love's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. Thank you, Robert Frost. You know, it's like, these voices are there, and somehow, as I've said elsewhere, they've created me in a way. They've shaped me. They fortified me. So I want to, in a way, the muse is the tradition, and I want to somehow add to that layering, and hopefully somebody will carry my words like I've carried others.
Oh, I love that answer, Major. That was very beautiful. I do not have a single muse either. I think that I like the very romantic and traditional idea that like this one person inspires you to create all this art is probably more true for visual artists, because representation functions differently in those media. But yeah, I think there are people who become muses just by virtue of being in, you know, being very important to you and creating problems and questions, or you create problems yourself in order to get out of the boredom. And I think of the muse as more, actually, I think of the muse as a more amorphous thing, as like inspiration, as like the goddess of inspiration that comes to you, and that can come in very different forms, and is not necessarily as like a human other. Yeah.
Someone just dropped this into the chat, and I actually think it segues really nicely into what you both have said. What do we get wrong about poets?
Well, one of the things that Aria said was that we should treat them like neighbors, right? That's the first thing. Do you want to start with that one?
Sure. What do we get wrong about poets? That is a great question, because I don't know what the assumption about poets is. Is it that we're very boring? Because I think we're not. Also, I think maybe there is the assumption of like the poet having the answer to all kinds of questions. The poet as like the wise hermit that you go to in order to find out about like really grand questions, or find the answers to very grand questions in your own life. And I actually think, like any medium or psychic, poets instead of answering questions, generate even more questions and maybe more precise questions. So that is, I think, something people get wrong about poetry and poets.
Mhm. Yeah, the whole oracle complex, like, but that the questions, God, isn't there a place for questions in our lives, right? I mean, I think you nailed it for me as to part of the reason why I seek out poets is because I know part of the journey is asking the right questions, as we say. I would answer that question maybe in thinking about how poetry exists in our lives at various points. When I was younger and trying to become a certain kind of musician, I turned to poets to kind of help train my ear towards the cadences of speech, and how can I embody a certain kind of flow. But then later, after some events in my life, it's true that poetry, I turned to poetry for some sort of measure on my own life as it was lived relative to others. So I think, if somehow that figuring out why we turn to poetry, sometimes I just want to be entertained by language. Other times it's far weighty. But I think if we also learn to live with doubt and uncertainty and enjoy the poem for what it offers us at that moment, we'll start getting poetry.
Preview of episode we recorded rather recently now.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right.
And then this actually also, we've had a number of questions about this, and I think it's something that can apply to the writing of episodes of the Slowdown, but also for poetry, and they might have different answers. How do you approach writing about other people in your poems? Do you change names? And then somebody so eloquently put it, how do you, quote, find the line you should not cross, accredited to Karen McCadden, if there is one, when writing poems about others' lives? Kind of weighty and multi-question, but I would love to just, let's take some approaches and some jabs at it.
Sure.
Do you want to go first, Major, or I can start?
I'll start. Approaching writing about others, this is one of the areas in which I feel like we have evolved. I mean, it was all out, take no prisoners, even just like, 10, 15 years ago. But I love the thoughtfulness by which we are approaching. The fact of the matter is that we're always going to write about each other. Like, we're not going to suddenly abandon the task of bearing witness to communities, bearing witness to ourselves. But I do think in this day and age, it is best practice to at least allow one's relatives or friends or whomever to at least have a say in some way. I think in a way, part of what we're reacting to is the poem eclipses any possibility of their interpretation of events. Now, that said, I would not want relatives or friends to, with every poem, rubber stamp every poem that I write. I think it can be done in such a way that that it's considered, it's gentle, it's generous, and it doesn't. I know we're in an age of taking down people. I remember that as part of the legacy of the traditions that I write out of. And it just feels like it sullies the art in a big way. But what's your thought, Aria?
That's a really complicated question that I'm still, I think, living through in order to find the answer, because I don't know where the line is. And yeah, I change names. I try to change a lot of details. But of course, I think the people who I write about know that it is written about them most of the time. I think it's easier to write about family because you have archetypes that you can refer to, and I like to make use of those. But with friends or actual people and what they've said, I try to stay away from using too much of that and try to employ my imagination and like the aspiring fiction writer in me in order to use those in poetry. But I have, so it is very complex, but I know that there are poets like Ada Limon, the former host of the podcast and US Poet Laureate, who will get permission from people when when she writes poems that are very close to real life and make use of other people's stories and other people's pain. And then I also know that Sharon Olds, who was my professor at NYU, with some of her work, she just has this agreement with her children and her closest family that they should not read her poetry, and I don't know whether they adhere to that or not, but that is that is like the symbolic contract they have, which gives her permission to write whatever she wants to write. And even she has poems, I think, somewhere in a vault that she won't publish, which feels hard to imagine because she's such a confessional and transparent poet. But I think
we
everybody
talked
has
about the language poets in class pretty heatedly at one point, and this might have been one of the cruxes of it. I'm sorry.
No. I was done. I was done. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I recall a conversation, but here's the thing. My family knows I love them. And so that, like, you know what I mean? Like, they know I'm gonna be gentle and take care. And I think that, I'm not gonna run out and have them sign a non-disclosure, statement, but I think I do have that symbolic permission.
I'll also add, per the question regarding the show, we sometimes change names just to be safe so that like no one knows who Major's doctor is, for example. Just general, we're creating a false discourse, I guess. But I have a question that's specifically for Aria. If you could describe how you first found poetry, and this is an and not an or, which I find interesting, and how it found you.
Beautiful question. So, and how it found me. First, how I found poetry, I think probably very young. First of all, my family's language is Farsi, hello cat, and Farsi is an incredibly poetic language, and we just have so many sayings and metaphors that are purely poetic if you transliterate them and make no sense and are extremely corny. So I think part of it was just always in my consciousness to be drawn towards metaphor and exaggeration and like a kind of physical, like a vessel for the physical aspects of the body, like a metaphoric vessel. For example, when you say I miss you, it's kind of like my soul or my being has grown tight for you, which feels like an insane, like an insane way of expressing that. Then, of course, I encountered German poetry quite young because I lived in Germany, and I remember really loving Rilke, who is obviously a big and weird influence on me. But I remember most vividly, I think, in my teenage years when we studied literature after Auschwitz in Germany in high school, reading Paul Celan's Todesfuge or Death Fugue, and that poem just changed something in my consciousness. And I remember sitting in the classroom and hearing to someone read it out loud, and it's just like transposed to elsewhere, and something, it felt like something chemical had happened to me, like something changed. And I just thought, wow, that is sorcery. that language can do that, and I want to learn what it is, and I started writing more seriously after that. But how did it find me? Yeah, probably through Ceylon. I think that was the moment it found me, and through friends in London who were really into poetry and showed me that it was alive and not dead.
I see a connection between your family's proclivity towards metaphor and the grandeur of those particular poets, Black Bread of Night, or, you know, Rilke, You Are All the Gardens I Ever Gazed At. I mean, some of them are corny, but there's a grandeur, a bigness, a largeness in those utterances that kind of get inside of us, right? And kind of open up a possibility for us to feel largely, going back
Absolutely, yes.
to piercing, you know? Yeah.
We're needing to wrap soon, sadly. This is going to be the last question for both of you. If you could give, we've had many people ask for tips for new writers, people who are newer to poetry, maybe like people who aren't going to be pursuing it in a degree fashion, but like want to be writing, and also for people who maybe want to be like submitting. It's been coming at every angle. People want advice. If each of you could give a tip, I think that would satisfy many question askers.
As someone who edits and still gets rejection letters, regarding getting your work out there, make your writing life the center of your life. Don't make it periphery, or incorporate it into the sinew of who you are and how other people kind of see you. I think in order to, particularly for emergent writers, once you see yourself as a writer, you need others to see you as a writer. And I think sharing your work, not just in publications, but readings, self-produced chapbooks, poems for holidays to give to friends, all of that really goes towards constructing a life around language. And when you're operating from that particular space, whether you're sending words work out, enrolling in workshops, something transformative happens to who you are. And that's when we talk about poems writing us, I think that's the gift of this life. How about you, Ari?
I loved your answer. I mean, yeah, the question was very general. I'm just seeing someone putting a joke in the chat that you should get a Stegner, which, yeah, you should if you can. Of course, you should try and get writing time if you can, like where people pay you to just write poetry for 2 years, either through an MFA or through another kind of fellowship. I think that helps immensely. But even before that, I loved what you said about make writing the center of your life, because in the year or 2 years before I came to NYU as a master's student, which was a pivotal time for me, where I think my career as a poet really started. I was writing all the time, but I also had a full-time job, and I was writing on the weekends and like in the evenings, and sometimes I would go to the bathroom and stay there a little long and write something on my phone. And yeah, I think it isn't necessarily healthy, right? Like to really dedicate a big part of yourself to an art that seems so vague and far away. But if you really believe in your own writing and in your poetry and you want to get better, I think you need to read as much as possible and also just write as much as possible. And a lot of the drafts will be bad. And I still write so many bad drafts that I hope nobody.
What do you do with them? What do you do with those bad drafts? Where do they live?
Well, they just pollute my very messy computer desktop. And I sometimes hope that I can return to something years later and salvage a line or an image or understand what I was attempting there and maybe save it, even if the draft itself doesn't get saved. There is often even that one like coupling of a phrase, of an adjective with a noun or a specific verb that was surprising. You can recycle. You have to recycle. Yeah. So yeah, and then submission is just hard. I also still get rejections all the time, and it's just, I think that's just part of the business. You know?
Yeah.
I think those were both, that was a very, very good selection of advice. I really appreciated hearing that as well. And that wraps us up. Thank you both so much for really this just like absolutely lovely hour that I wish was not over. Aria, thank you for joining the Slowdown family in this way. We're so happy to have you with us. And then thank you also to everybody who joined. This has been, I've enjoyed the chat so much. Also, there has been some really beautiful conversations happening between people in there. So thank you for being a part of our community. The Slowdown is a public media podcast, and a really important part of our budget comes from generous donations. You can show your love for tonight's conversation by donating, which we would really appreciate. This is the beginning of our National Poetry Month campaign, where we would really appreciate anybody and everybody stepping up to just help us keep going. We've been a part of your life for over 800 episodes, and we want to keep that going to 1,000, 2,000, as far as we can keep it going, I swear. And we have some new thank you gifts. If you do want to kind of show off some Slowdown swag, we have these very cool blue glass mugs that kind of look a little bit like our cover art. And we're also going to have a zine of writing prompts. So if you are looking for writing tips, we have prompts from some of our Slowdown family, and I even wrote one. And that is donation at any level. So thank everybody so much. Thank you for joining us. And we really hope to see you soon in any kind of new programming we do like this. And again, Major Aria, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.